Welcome. My name is Alex Sakariassen. I'm a freelance journalist and writer here in town. Been here for a long time, University of Montana Journalism School graduate. Earlier this year, my mother, Amu Guthrie Sakariassen, member of the Bismarck Historic Preservation Commission and North Dakota advisor to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and Donna McRae, the professor and head of archives and special collections at the University of Montana. Earlier this year, my mom tasked me with the overwhelming project of going through about 16 years of correspondence between my grandfather, A.B. Guthrie Jr., and an high school English teacher from upstate New York named Robert Cubbins. Cubbins had been published in outdoor journals. He was an avid outdoorsman, hunter, fisherman. And he wrote, as you can see from this first letter, I'm just going to go through a few of the letters from the correspondence before I turn things over to you two. Back in March of '75, Cubbins wrote to Bud asking for an autographed copy of The Big Sky. He taught a course, as he notes here, Literature of the American West, and The Big Sky was his Bible. And he was hoping to get an autographed copy. And in response, Bud wrote back to him, noting that he always responded to such requests, at least when he could, and that he'd be happy to send a copy of The Big Sky. From there, Cubbins sent about a 5-page letter, which I did not include because, a lot of you probably don't want to read that much. But later, Bud asked, in return for the book, Cubbins had offered to make him a pair of custom moccasins, which he did. And Bud noted that that was really far too much in exchange for a simple autographed copy of a book, and asked instead for a few wet flies, size 8 Royal Coachmen, to use on the Teton River up near Shoto. And from there, Cubbins, who also raised English setters, offered to send an English setter to Shoto for the family, named after the titular character of The Big Sky, Boone. They shipped him out by air in 1976, a year after the correspondence began. And Cubbins made his habit of illustrating letters abundantly clear with a little illustration of Boone. This correspondence went on for quite a long time. In '77, Bud and my grandmother Carol returned from a trip in England where he had done quite a few appearances, and he confessed that he fizzled a few times. At this point, Cubbins had clearly become a confidant and something of a very close friend. Cubbins, in response, wrote that he'd known and had posted a letter the day that Bud wrote his. So, this correspondence clearly became, something between two friends that was struck up through the simple act of letter writing. And eventually, Bud began to tell Cubbins quite a lot about what was going on the Rocky Mountain front, including the purchase of the historic Gleason Dude Ranch by the Nature Conservancy, a conservation nonprofit that works across the globe, as well as the nearby Pine Butte Swamp, clearly documenting, things that were going on in his backyard in a way that I'm sure he didn't realize would wind up on the historic record. And also began writing to Cubbins and keeping him apprised of his progress in writing. And at this point, Cubbins had become what he referred to as a goad for Bud, constantly telling him that he wanted to see the next chapter, the next 5 chapters, the next 10 chapters, and inspiring him to continue writing. And at one point, Bud wrote, as you can see in the second paragraph there, also documenting his relationship with other well-known Montana authors, going down to a book sale in Missoula where he hung out with Dick Hugo and Jim Welch, who were close friends. And as time went on...
Where'd the nickname Steamboat come from?
I'll leave that to the woman who has all the answers. And then at one point, my mother, Amy, went to Harvard and was not too far from Glens Falls, which prompted talk of a visit to Cubbins and his wife. At which point, Cubbins emphatically answered, "Amy's coming, Amy's coming, Amy's coming." Yes. So at this point, by 1980, just 4 years into this correspondence, the families had grown quite close to the point of visits and nicknames and everything. But eventually, Bud started to, what? There's a certain tone and humor that these two adopted when writing to each other, which, you know, is entertaining to read. But eventually, Bud in 1980 mentioned this desire to revisit one of his characters who was in The Big Sky and The Way West, Dick Summers, and began to talk about, as you can note in this second paragraph, what sort of historic events in Montana and in the Rocky Mountain West would be covered in that book. And that eventually became, let's see, yeah, so you can see here Cubbins encouraging Bud to write. I'm trying to get to, I'll skip ahead here because we're running out of time. Here we go. Eventually, this took shape, this Dick Summers novel took the form of Bud's book, Fairland, Fairland. And in this letter, he let Cubbins know that the dedication was to him, to Robert F. Cubbins, friend, promoter, and goad, which gives you a sense of how close these two grew in just 5 years. And you know, as time went on, you know, their later correspondences covered everything from weather to gastric distress, and my mother's engagement with my father, and Bud's consternation over the shooting of a grizzly sow not far from his home. These were something of a warm-up for Bud at the typewriter before he set about writing his latest chapters. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mom and ask you if you can kind of give us some context of who Cubbins was when he entered the Guthrie family household.
Well, context is my favorite word anyway. I think it's probably the most important concept going. Bob Cubbins blew in like a huge wind of energy into our family's life. From the very beginning, his letters were something we all shared. He was hilarious, absolutely hilarious in what he wrote. He wrote things that were over the top. He used mountain man dialect. He tried to entertain Bud. Bud tried to entertain him back. And because shortly after the correspondence began, Mom and Bud left Missoula. It had been their winter home through my high school. But they built a home over by the old family cabin, Twin Lakes. And so they had a year-round place. They moved out there, which meant they were 25 miles out in the town with no real neighbor. And so the letters became increasingly important as they had a fairly restricted life. The age difference between Mom and Bud was 30 years. When they married, Bud was 68, Mom was 38. My brother and I were still in junior high. I was in grade school. And they knew all along in their lives that they would not have as many years of marriage as many people would hope to have. So they kept themselves to themselves. And I think my cousin Peggy would agree with that. They did not, they had a fairly limited circle of people that they were close with. Some of the writers' family members and the just neighbors in the Shoto area. But Bud, having lived to be in his 70s by the time these letters began, had outlived many of his old friends. And many of his newer friends, like Dick Hugo and Jim Welch, were considerably younger, but they weren't living near him anymore. And Bob became the best friend you have, but you don't have to take time out of your day to have coffee with him. He was just the great friend that all he had to do was entertain him. And then he entertained him back, and he did, as Alexander said, he did warm up, and he references that a lot in the letters, that, he warmed those old fingers up at the typewriter by getting his juices flowing, and you'd hear him laugh, because we have kept the family home, and we have his office pretty much as it was, and it's an open loft over a living room and kitchen. And so we just went about our business when I was living at home or when people were visiting. Everybody just did their thing, and Bud went up and typed. He'd been trained as a newspaperman. He was a newspaperman for many years. So noise did not get in the way of his creative juices at all. But he did like to limber up, and you'd hear him up there laughing. And you'd know he wasn't working on the chapter. You'd know he was. And then you'd hear him every once in a while say, "Yeah, got him here. I'm funnier than he was." So there was a little bit of competition between them in their relationship. And I think that as they really did sort of hit the right notes with each other as the relationship developed, that's what created this whole long, massive number of letters. And Bob was enthusiastic. I mean, when his arthritis was bad, he'd write pages of letters. And we in the country only got our mail 3 times a week. So if there was not a letter from Bob, Bud would just be furious, because then he couldn't respond, because that's the thing with letters that are unlike so many other things. They are a true relationship. Your letters interrelate. Something Bud would say would be responded to by Bud. The volley of whatever silliness that one of them said had to be responded to in kind by the other. So letters are unique, I think, in that way. My husband and I have talked about this. Letters aren't like journals. A journal is personal. Letters are personal, but they're interpersonal. They are meant to be a dialogue. And that's one of the reasons that I thought that Alexander might enjoy taking the burden of looking over these things and scanning them for me, because his grandfather died when he was only 5 years old. And so this, I have felt, is an opportunity that letters can sometime afford. It's not usually a family member, but in this case, a family member looking at and maybe learning something about his grandfather, about the kind of things his grandfather found funny as an adult, not entertaining a 5-year-old. There are different things that are revealed in letters, and I thought that this particularly lengthy relationship actually would afford that.
Well, I mean, in 1981, we were already at 247 letters.
Yeah, well,
Is there
are a
each
lot of them.
number?
And Bob and Bud did have nicknames for each other and for us. Steamboat, I have no exact idea where that came from. Sometimes Bob was called Hoss. Sometimes what am I? I actually got a letter. My last letter from Cubbins was 91. And he wrote to me and his exaggerated, wild handwriting, and he said, "Dear Little Red Rider." You know, he's just, but everybody had a name. My brother, Herbert William, was Billy, I.E. So he was Billy, your dad. And so all of these letters about Billy being too brilliant to be stuck being a linguist. You know, he should be creating things, you know, the linguistics professor. But because the friendship went on so long and the type of intimacy that developed between our families, because he'd read the letters out loud. We'd all read it. Did we get a letter from Cubbins? We didn't get to read Bud's letters until we got them from Cubbins to see. So those were all, what? He wrote about, he should not have written about Alexander that way.
I'm curious, because I feel like complete collections like this don't necessarily always survive. You know, you definitely keep one side of the correspondence, but how did you go about getting the full collection of Bud's letters to Cubbins?
Well, I think that because Mom always valued literally everything Bud ever scratched out, she valued. And she thought that there might be something interesting that could come out of looking at those letters together as a volume or as some kind of a research project or a study. She thought that there was potential there, but only if they were all together. And Bob had, he sent the copies, and he was quite willing to do that. I frankly can't remember whether Mom got them from him or whether I did, but we do have both sides of the correspondence, which is really nice because, frankly, Cubbins are far more attractive because he had such a dramatic personality, and he'd do these cartoons. Every one of us has been cartooned. He drew a picture on the back of an envelope one time, and he was questioning why they called Ear Mountain, because it used to be called Elephant Deer Butte. So in this picture, he's got this big old elephant sitting up on top of a view going like, what? And he had one of my favorite ones is of Alexander, who Bud had apparently written letters of how annoying it was to have a small child around when you were actually not wanting to pay attention to a small child. His mother and grandmother left him alone with them and went to town some hour round trip, and he had to deal with the kid, but he really needed to be writing a letter or doing something else, and he crabbed in a letter. And so Cubbins wrote a letter back with a picture of a child in a diaper, and Sakariassen is obviously a Scandinavian name, so he decided he'd call him Hagar. So there's little Hagar, and he's cartooned in a Viking helmet with a little pitchfork, and he's creeping up behind his grandfather, typing diligently on the typewriter, and he's sticking in behind. So, I mean, what's not to love about a guy that does things like that to entertain you? So.
Well, I'm curious, kind of kicking it over to Donna, how often full collections like this, in your experience, survive, and what's lost when they don't?
I can't actually answer the question about how often they survive, because I think there are a lot of families like yours that are holding those collections that we're not aware of. We certainly in the archives have a lot of one side, the received letters, but then we do have other collections where we have gotten both sides, because if everybody was from a family and there wound up being one family member who was sort of the archivist for the family, they might have gathered both sides and then donated them to us. So I do think that what's lost if you don't get both sides is exactly what you were talking about earlier, the opportunity to have both sides of the story and hear the real interplay and the questions and the answers and the development of the story over time. It's certainly wonderful when the entire body of work is retained, and if it's retained from both sides, so much the better.
Well, and how did because I know Bud corresponded with quite a few other people, how did the tone of these differ?
You know, I think that's probably, I hadn't really paid too much attention to that until starting to think about these things. It is a matter of voice. The voice of two people is represented here. I think in most of the letters that I know exist in the correspondences that took place between Bud and other people, because normally of those I've only seen the letter from the other person, because Bud didn't type in, he didn't do carbons and things like that, so we just have the letter from that person, so you have to extrapolate to what he had said. But most of those letters would have been far less personal than, I mean, even maybe not to say Jim Welch. They had a good bantering relationship, and Dick Hugo. Any of those letters would have been fairly loose as well. But most of the other ones, I think, would have been more professional, a little less frisky than, and certainly give us much less of what his actual voice as a letter writing person was. You know, you can see some of these letters. I actually wanted to do this because I think this was a little, I dug around. I'm the family hoarder. There's a name for it. There's a name for it. And I found the first copy of the first letter that Bud wrote to me and to my brother after he had met us, before Mom and he were married. He did adopt us when we were older, but at this time, before they were married, you know, we had another father. But he wrote these letters to us, and we were living in Illinois. I was probably 10. And he liked to entertain children, and Peggy may remember this as well, by saying tongue twisters or saying something silly or telling a silly story. But he had told us a limerick or a verse that went: 1 hen, 2 ducks, 3 squawking geese, 4 corpulent porpoises, 500 literary oysters in full battle array, 8 emphatic, peripatetic old gentlemen on crutches, and it went on like that, all of which we're supposed to remember. And of course, we never forgot those. But the first letter we got from him says, "Dear 2 ducks," because of that. And he said, "Here is a test you might give your father. If at first try he can repeat correctly the 2 lines I am about to type, he qualifies as a genius, but I will bet 1 nickel he can't. Now you must read the lines carefully to make sure you understand and do not stammer over them. After asking him to repeat the lines you are about to read, go ahead and read them, not hurrying, but not being too slow either. The lines go: whiskey makes you well when you're sick. Whiskey when you're well makes you sick. Tell me how he comes out. Don't try them on your mother." Luck, my friends. And that is not a correspondence that children of like 11 normally get from an adult. So he knew we were going to be in his life. And this is what he did when he knew you were going to be in his life. He kind of woos you in his letters. And so the family letters will always be more personal than the ones to, you know, James Lee Burke, I know that he wrote to him. Those would not have this kind of engaging relationship. But I found that amusing because, of course, I'd forgotten it.
Well, I think I think you've definitely made it clear like what the sort of family importance or value of these types of correspondences are. But Donna, I'm curious what from your perspective, what the sort of historic and cultural value and potential usage of these types of correspondence collections are.
Yeah, so in the archives we see letters used in a variety of ways, and some examples are people who are writers who want to get an authentic voice from a time period will come and read correspondence from that time period, and again reading maybe letters between family members, but also the more formal letters to businesses or whatever it might be, just to get a sense of what are the words that are commonly used, how do people phrasing things, what are they talking about, and what's on people's mind. Certainly they're used by historians to get a first-person account of events. We look at the letters that people in the military, soldiers, write back home and how they explain their experiences, for example, on the battlefield to their mother versus those who maybe saved a journal, and we also have their journal entries and can compare those side by side. So we'll see them in that way. And then we see them, for example, students at the university are looking into letter collections just to understand women's lives and how women were writing back and forth to each other, or what their activities were that they were documenting in their letters. So I've seen them used in a number of different, both scholarly and personal ways. There's a person who's coming into town this week to look at a letter collection that we have because he's writing a screenplay and he wants that sort of sense of authenticity that he thinks he can get from reading correspondence between family members.
Well, I'd never thought about it, but I suppose that there is for a writer, a researcher, there's a certain value in comparing comparing letters between women and women, and men and women and, I mean, people certainly do write differently, whether they're writing to a guy friend or their mother, or things like that. I think that's kind of an interesting thing I hadn't actually really thought of, but when you think about voice and what can be learned from correspondences, that's something that comes to mind.
I will say that one of the challenges is the voices that are lost, the voices that are, the letters that either were never written or they were written by people who then didn't have other people to save those letters, or, to be perfectly frank, the letters that were not valued in past generations. So in our own archives, we have a lack of the voices of people of color. We have a lack of the voices of people who were from lower working class areas, or didn't have the level of education as people whose papers and letters have traditionally wound up in archives. And I think that's a real problem, and I think this is a reason why we are trying really hard to encourage people to keep their own histories and to value the letters that they are writing and receiving now, regardless of where you are and who you are.
I've noticed, I work in the archives in North Dakota now, and I have noticed something that I didn't really appreciate until I started looking at photographs and archival collections, but there were so many that the postcard sending thing with all these pictures that are printed on postcards and sent, and I have found in the collections, now that we're talking, I have found in the collections that there are more people whose handwriting indicates less education on postcard things that I find in the collections. maybe it was easier, maybe it was less intimidating, because if you were not a person of education and perhaps your spelling was, everything's sort of forgiven on a postcard.
Interesting. I
But
hadn't thought about that.
in North Dakota, our collections, so many of them have things that are leftover, lost, postcard things because we are such a state of immigration. So the Scandinavian countries and the Germans from Russia that came over, those letters are certainly people who were writing back. These are, a lot of them are ones from Germany or ones from Russia, or, and if you get it, we have some of them that go both ways, I mean, I've seen both. I can't read it, it's in Swedish, sorry, we get somebody to do it. But even if you can't read the letter, you can tell if somebody is accustomed to writing. And so but I wonder if that, it's interesting, because I have seen so many of those postcards, and they are not written by people. So maybe this is where we should be looking more for some of the representation of those less represented peoples. Maybe they are represented, we're not seeing.
Not looking in the right places.
We're looking for letters and envelopes, and maybe we should be looking for.
Yeah.
Well, that makes me wonder. I mean, like, what types of voices do you typically see preserved in this manner, or in the archives? I mean,
well,
because I know that a lot of archives have the correspondences of like famous authors or famous politicians, but I'm wondering like what voices you tend to see come across your desk more often than not.
Well, more and more often we are actively collecting the voices of families of what I would call average people. We're also, as a profession, really encouraging more, like if it's a group, perhaps it's of preserving voices in an area or a way where context can be preserved. So if you are maybe of a religious community and there happens to be an archives within that religious community, or you're a tribal community and there's an appropriate place within that tribal community, that maybe rather than sending your materials to a university archive, then keeping them near or within the group that is their home, where people there can interpret them appropriately and contextually, is more of what we're seeing as a profession and what we're encouraging as a profession. But we at the University of Montana are trying, because a lot of our early collecting was done between the 60s and the 80s, when there was a real emphasis at the University of Montana by Ross Toole and others who were in the history department. They were really interested in business history and political history, and so the voices that are getting surfaced out of those collections, it's pretty rare when the women's voices were the ones that were surfaced, even when they existed in those collections. So we are trying to sort of be more proactive about collecting the voices of the average person and the average family, and where it seems to be appropriate, the ethnic communities of people of color, individuals, LGBTQ communities, so that our students at the university can see themselves represented in our collections, including in our letter collections when they come in.
Well, and Mom, I was curious if you could speak a bit more to Bob outside these letters, because I know that Cubbins came to visit a lot. You went to visit him and his wife in Glens Falls. And I wonder if you could speak more to, the relationship outside of these letters, or the relationship that, kind of sprung from the well of, this initial correspondence.
Everybody was a little nervous the first time they came out, because, his letters are a little over the top, and we're going, is this going to be like having Fred Flintstone, illiterate Fred Flintstone, come flopping all over the place being crazy? And yeah, it kind of was. But he was a very sweet person. But he was so dog crazy the dog that he sent, literally, he would have sent us a dog a year. But the first dog, Boone, was the stupidest dog that ever drew breath. He was like this champion stock back to God knows what. But we knew, because the letters really outlined the lineage of this dog. And every wonder dog that he'd had, he did go on a little bit. But in person, he was a little less like that. And so his personality was slightly exaggerated in the letters. So once he got to visit us, he was fine. And his wife was very sweet. His first wife was very sweet. But because he was compatible and companionable, and all his talking about drinking some marvelous scotch that only he knew about. He actually really didn't. He built himself up to entertain Bud. Bud really didn't do that so much. He just was perhaps more curmudgeonly in his letters. So Bob was probably a little disappointed that Bud wasn't an old crab. But he sent so many different things. He was a man of great, outside of the letters, he was a man of great interests. And he took up scrimshaw, he tied flies, he did beaded moccasins, he did pretty much anything you could do, he did.
Oh, and Bud gave him advice on a manuscript that he'd written.
Yes, and he wrote as well. He was published in a number of things. And it is to both their credits, because as a writer of Bud's reputation, he was always very good to people who hadn't, at least during my time as his daughter, he was very good to people who sent stuff and wanted advice. I don't think he had always been as kind in his younger days, but he dealt out kindness to Bob because he didn't ever want to hurt Bob by saying, yeah, maybe that piece not so good. So he did offer constructive advice to him. He did, but Bob also never wanted to appear as if he had pursued this relationship to get Bud behind him. It was not that kind of relationship. They were very lucky that they didn't have to see each other as much, because Bud would have been really tired out. And that was one thing that Mom would say. They went to visit them once in Glens Falls. I went to visit them as well. I think Bill may have, I can't remember. But I know when I went there, I was a little nervous too, because I thought, oh my God, there are going to be 9,000 dogs. They're going to be all over me. I'm going to be having down in the basement tying flies. It's going to drag me out. I'm going to get bit by ticks. There's all this. And actually, they had this extraordinarily tidy house. Extraordinarily. It was actually, he was kind of a real proper New Englander. And I felt kind of like loud, rude, Little Red Rider rolling in there. And actually I had to I ended up making sure I didn't leave lint on the, but they were good friendly people to be around. And we certainly, and oddly enough, because he was about Mom's age, and I think they both died the same month. He continued to write to all of us after Bud died. He didn't just drop us. But Mom wasn't much of a letter writer. And this is one of those things that I actually wanted to bring up for a second. This not having both sides of a collection. My mother and Bud wrote for years. And when she found she was dying, she decided she didn't want anybody else to see her letters. So she burned all hers, or had her friend burn all hers, but she saved Bud's. So it's like, hello. For one thing, it's their, word of advice. If you don't want to read your parents' courtship letters, don't.
Well, and that brings me to a good question for Donna, and then I'm going to kick it over to questions from the audience for about 10 minutes. But I was wondering what advice you might have for folks who might have documents like this in damp basement or a musty, hot old attic.
So I would just strongly encourage people to save the letters that they have, if they have them, or diaries, things that the photographs. I would encourage you to document what you have. So if you know who the writer and the recipient are, but you think maybe other people in your family wouldn't know that if you're not around, I'd get that written down pretty quickly. I would be sure that the paper materials that you want to have last as long as possible are in the dark, in stable temperature and humidity, so not in a basement which tends to be too damp, and not in an attic that tends to be too hot, or in the garage where the temperature really fluctuates. If you're working all electronically, which most of us are now, then you could print the correspondence that you really want to be sure that you keep. That can be a little onerous, but it does tend to be sure that if you're suddenly not around, the next person would be able to have access to that. But another option would be just to be sure that you're doing a regular export into an open source format. Like if you're coming out of Gmail, you would use an mbox format, or if you're coming out of, and you can Google this and find out sort of what to do, but essentially what I would recommend is having not just the one copy of your electronic material, and not necessarily relying on the provider that you're using to always be available to you. And then again, because it can be, if you haven't left your passwords with somebody, or if somebody doesn't know that you have a Gmail account, or that you've done some things in Gmail, but you have also a Hotmail or some other account, and they don't know, if you want that stuff to be found, tell people that it exists, give them the password, or be sure that you're doing a download and a conversion on a regular basis, and then have multiple copies. So one copy on your computer, one copy in the cloud, one copy on a hard drive. If it's that important and you want it to survive, and it's electronic material, that's really sort of the way that it has to go.
Well, do you think people are going to, I worry that we're going to have far less of that sort of window into how people 20 years ago, 50 years ago thought, because that digital record does not survive even as imperfectly as letters did.
We're going to have different things. I think we lost a lot when we got telephones, because people people were calling and they weren't writing back and forth to each other anymore. I think that as people do more and more electronically, yes, there's certainly the potential, and it has happened, that electronic material is lost. But also people are putting things, they're blogging and they're tweeting, and they're putting them out there in environments that are being captured. So what I think might happen is that, and like the Library of Congress is preserving all tweets. We may not have what I really value, which is the context. So just what you've described here, the ability to have both sides of the story, and then to have more information about that person. We know more about Bud Guthrie, and because we have more of a body of his material, that may be lost as things become ephemeral in the electronic environment. But we're also going to have voices that we haven't had before be captured in a way that they haven't been captured before.
Well, and you're right, the blogging and stuff is that is, at least that's sort of maybe the modern journal.
Yeah,
for a lot of people it is more of, this is what I feel, rather than a exchange. But interesting.
But it is a challenge, and so again, to care for your materials. At this point in the 21st century, you have to be proactive about it rather than passive about it.
Well, I had something. Had this for just a sec. I had this on my thing to remind me. I was talking about this panel to a friend of mine in Bismarck, and I said, "Ugh, my parents, it's a good thing I didn't have them read those letters." And she said, "Oh, huh." And then she told me her story. She is an Army brat, and her parents were separated by the Vietnam War. And every night, for a half hour, she went into the bedroom and taped a conversation to send to her husband. And this friend of mine has a box of these tapes. And she said, "Oh, what do I do with them? I don't even have one of those things anymore." And it honestly, I had remembered that in World War II, people would they'd make a record and send it to their soldier. But I never really realized that it went to tape stuff in Vietnam. I mean, everybody was doing differently for the more contemporary things. But I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder how many people have these things that they are not even going to know what they are. They're just going to, I don't know, throw it out, not listen to it. But it was a format that I had not actually thought of as being a letter.
A letter, yeah. Really good.
So,
Well, we've got about 6 minutes, I think, for audience questions. So does anybody?
I would like to know how you find the appropriate place, the appropriate archives for something. I have all of my mother's World War II letters to my father.
Yeah.
I've typed them up. I have them digitally saved, and I printed them off for people in the family. But how do you find the right archive?
So there are archives that are focused on subject areas. So there are military archives, there are archives that specialize in like World War II materials. There are also archives like mine that are location-based. So if your parents were in Missoula, or one of them was in Missoula, or they're from Missoula, then our location might be very appropriate for you. If they were in Kansas, then maybe it's the University of Kansas, or the North Dakota, maybe it's the University of North Dakota or the North Dakota Historical Society. So some entity. I would encourage a professionally staffed entity, so that if your goal is to make them available, they might have the resources and the staff to do that work. But it really depends on the subject matter, but also sometimes the location of where the person is from or where they're living when they're writing. Because for us, we try to document the history of Missoula, the university, Western Montana, and so if somebody offered us a collection that was
Virginia
from
Johnson.
Kansas, right, then it just people wouldn't think to look here, and it would take our resources for us to work with that away from resources that we could be working with things that were in our scope. Does that help?
Yeah, this is back east, but so I should contact Rutgers or someplace.
If they're in that area, and if that's not the appropriate place, they probably have someplace that they could refer you to.
Thank you.
Any other questions from audience?
Did you feel like he was your kind of uncle or something like that? Did he feel like a member of your family?
Bob? Yeah, he was.
Did he come to your wedding?
No. I practically didn't come.
There's a story.
No, actually, we almost had to cancel the wedding. Bud had been in the hospital for so long, and literally, I'm the only person I know that was married in her great grandmother's petticoat that her brother ironed, because we didn't have time to get anything else. My mother had to handwrite the invitations. Even our good friends from Missoula, the Welches and the Hugos, didn't come over because they knew we were getting married in our sunroom, because Bud could be propped up there because he really hadn't been well, and Dick took up too much space. because he was kind of heavy at the time, and Mom said, Bud, you have to tell Dick he can't come. She said, well, then Ripley won't come. Yeah, that's the way it goes. So, no, he felt like a dear family friend. I mean, just like the courtesy uncle, I suppose, that isn't really a relative. But on the other hand, the time that I went to, when Alexander referred to that, I went to visit him, I had been doing an apprenticeship in as a fossil preparation person at Harvard, and having a really miserable time. And so back then, it was before cell phones, and I'm whining around on the phone. I had to go find a pay phone and put my quarters in and crab to my parents, who then immediately called Bob, and Bob sent me a ticket to take the bus up. So he was the closest to a family member, closest to get me to, so that I felt like I was okay again. Because I just was having a miserable time. I needed to whine and cry a little bit, and so I got my soft berth there. So it was that kind of, he was the sort of friend that any one of us would have trusted. That if Bud had a hangnail and complained about it, Bob was on the phone too. So it wasn't just letters. It went more thoroughly through our lives. And from that really quite personal relationship was truly a family friendship. So if that answers it.
What next with these letters? I'm just fascinated. Is there any plan on putting it together in some kind of a compilation for all of us to read?
He has to redact some of those words that Covens tends to use.
Yeah, they got a little heavy into the mountain man speak at the time.
That's what
I agree.
But I still have to get enough plastic sleeves because Covens tended to write on this like onion skin parchment that just is falling apart. And so I'm trying to get them into plastic sleeves to keep them together. And I don't know, is there a better thing?
Or even to publish them like that. Just people would be interested, I think.
They're hysterical. There are also some photographs. Not to surprise anybody, but Bob Covens also played the bagpipes. So I have all these pictures of Bob with his kilt and his bagpipe, and of course his faithful litter of English setters littering the landscape. So there's, I think that they have a potential to be amusing on a broader scale, simply because they have some texture to them. They're not just a one format. They're not just typed. We have typed, we have written, we have illustrated, we have some photographs. I mean,
Postcards.
I think that
They're postcards.
Oh, yes, the
Covens
postcards.
sent from the road back to Glens Falls.
And the last thing you want to do is have an editor get a hold of it.
you have to. Bud liked to keep his editors in line, but I don't think they make editors like that anymore.
Well, we'll see what comes of it. That's a family conversation. Anything else? Otherwise, I think we might need to wrap things up. Clear the room for the next panel. So, well, thank you all for coming, and Donna, thank you.